Welcome, 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 one and all, to yet another episode of WhickTV, cross-ideological space where we come together to talk about issues both political and cultural, from the silly to the serious. And gang, have we got a show for you tonight? First things first, my mic stand attachment came in minutes before we went live. I didn't have time to install it or to mess with it and things like that. But I promise you, if you think I have mic troubles now, just wait till tomorrow when I have a brand new mic that I mess up in entirely different ways. But that's beside the point. Tonight we're going to be talking about welfare and socialized economies. Um, there is a question: uh, how much does welfare or a welfare system actually benefit us as people? Do we become reliant on the state, or is it a way to help those who are less um, fortunate get out of a rut? Is taxation something that we should be doing more of or less of, or in what degrees? When we talk about the economy itself, privatization versus socialization is a hot topic, and we're going to get into it. And I brought some great guests to talk about it tonight. So I'm going to give each of them a brief opening statement, a chance to introduce themselves, and we'll get right into it. We're going to start tonight by passing the ball to Lactoid. And Lactoid, uh, no stranger to my show. Tell people who you are and what your initial thoughts are, and we'll go from there.
Sure. So I'm Lactoid. You can find me at Lactoid TV on Twitch, Twitter, and YouTube. I am a libertarian, and according to some ANCAPs, I'm a socialist. I would consider
Wait, your
myself to be
Twitter
a
isn't Lactoid? I thought it was at
no,
Lactoid.
no. In fact, Wick made this mistake, and it turns out at Lactoid is a very different person, which you guys may be interested in following as well, depending on your sexuality. So you can look into that as well, but if you want to. But you can find me at Lactoid TV. That's where you can find me. Um, so I'm a libertarian, according to some ANCAPs. Also a socialist. I'm a lawyer. I am not an economist. I don't have any economist credentials, but I have some pretty strong moral opinions and some general statements to say about the world. So if you like that shit, give me a follow.
Okay, and Econoboy, tell people about yourself, I guess.
Yeah, sure. I guess just a little bit about me. I'm an economics and politics nerd. It's what I went to school for, and I do business now. I guess I went to business school as well, and that's sort of led me to where I am in terms of my political beliefs. In the last few years, I've gotten a significantly deeper interest and understanding in the welfare state and collective ownership and things like that, which has been a really fun research process. If you're interested in policy, you can, of course, subscribe to my channel, and that's just Econoboy and everything. But I recently started a podcast with a couple other wonky people, one named 𝕾𝖍𝖎, who's a neoliberal, and then one named Socialism Done Left, who's a socialist. And of course, I'm sort of the middle ground between the two, a filthy centrist social democrat. And so all three of us talk policy on our podcast called The Three Wonks or Three Wonks. I think it's at Three Wonks on YouTube. And so subscribe if you're interested in dense policy political discussions.
Okay, well, thank you guys for your introductions. Lactoid, what are your thoughts on a collectivized economy? Give us kind of your initial thoughts, and we'll just go from there.
On a collectivized economy, my general thoughts on okay, very large question, so I'll do my best to kind of break it up into something I can answer. A collectivized economy, and if we mean things like um, generally an economy focused on the left of the political spectrum, which would be maybe have more of an equity focus an egalitarian focus as opposed to a hierarchical focus. There's different ways you could do this. There's direct state ownership of the economy. There is uh, no state ownership of the economy, but having some kind of taxation system, welfare in place. And generally, I'm opposed to collectivization of the economy on principle due to the fact that um, it relies on stealing, right? Where charity is also could be argued to be some kind of egalitarian purpose to the economy. But what I think the difference in definition between charity and collectivization of the economy comes when you introduce the when you introduce force, when you introduce compulsion into the calculus, when you have it no longer being a voluntary exchange, but when you have it be the powers that be mandate that you give up some of your assets, you give up your time, your labor, um, in order to redistribute that to other people. Um, Maybe this is something that Econoboy will take umbrage with, but I think that I sort of ingest, but I sincerely kind of mean it. Economic leftism to me is very similar to it's like an economic way of thinking that's very similar to the way that incels think about sexuality, which is that they aren't getting any, and it's this great injustice, and so then they deserve this whatever they're not getting. But what both incels and leftists I think fail to account for, or maybe they don't fail, but they just disagree with me, which is that you don't have a right to other people's stuff and you don't have a right to other people's bodies. So you have to rely on them giving it to you and you providing something in exchange for them giving it to you. And that's the way that a free country should operate.
I'm curious, Econoboy's response to being an economic incel. What are your thoughts here?
The biggest economic insult, I guess. I mean, yeah, I guess to give my overview for like how I think of collectivized economy. So I'm not a socialist, right? So I don't really believe in like full socialization of investment or capital or anything like that. But I do think that taking like the Matt Brunig style view of institutional level socialism or capitalism kind of just makes the most sense to me. I think a lot of people struggle to classify like a country like Cuba, is that a socialist economy? Well, it's not very democratic, but like 70% of their GDP is from state owned enterprises. But what about that other 30%? Like, is that a capitalist economy? Like, people say the same thing about China. Norway, for instance, is an economy where 2/3 of its output comes from collectivized entities. Is that socialism? Well, maybe for the 2/3, but not the 1/3. So I kind of just take an institutional level view. Like if you have a democratically owned sort of state-owned enterprise, I would call that a form of socialist production. I would say the same thing about government services that provide, not necessarily fee for service, but sort of tax for service, like public transit, public schools, the police, fire departments. Again, these are all things that can be provided by a private market, but we've overwhelmingly decided that those are publicly owned entities, right, and democratically owned and accountable. Sovereign wealth fund ownership, employee stock ownership, worker cooperatives, consumer cooperatives. These are all forms of collective ownership. And an economy can be much more on the left side of things, let's say, with 100% of those institutions or, some combination of them. Or they can be further to the right of things where many more of those institutions are privatized, right? And so I think it's really just a matter of which institutions are best for the market and for people in general. I wouldn't necessarily call myself an incel, economically speaking, obviously, mostly because I think that my worldview isn't really based on sort of an individual sort of desert theory of who deserves what just from a sort of intrinsic level. I kind of have some basic moral intuitions that people would probably be better off if they didn't live in poverty. And if it were the case that we could do certain things that weren't distortionary greatly to the market, that didn't destroy wealth to any significant degree, but did in fact alleviate a significant amount of poverty. And, transitively, poverty is human suffering, right? And so, to the degree that we can eliminate that, that's probably good. And it seems like many societies across the world have engaged in some forms of democratic collectivism and also welfare spending, which have led to their societies having higher levels of economic freedom, having lower levels of poverty, lower levels of inequality. And that's sort of the foundational argument that I have, right? Is that if we can do things that lower inequality, maintain economic growth, maintain innovation, but also alleviate poverty and don't destroy the economy, then those things are probably good things to do.
Well, let's get to the brass tacks, right? Instead of general, let's go specific. You mentioned that there are things that we could do, or economies, countries, democracies, states can do in order to alleviate property. I'm sorry, poverty. That you would find that
Wow, Freudian
would be
slip
good.
there. Away.
Yeah, a little bit. Can you give us a couple examples of things that maybe Biden has done, or maybe Cuba has done, since you mentioned Cuba, or something else, Norway,
Mhm.
another country that you find we would be good to
Mhm.
implement here in America?
Yeah, sure. I would say Cuba is quite a bad example of collective ownership because what you find in the literature is that collective entities, whether they be government services, state enterprises, or sovereign wealth funds, sort of collective wealth management, what you find is that it's really bad when autocracies run these things or autocratic institutions. Whereas when you have more transparent democratic institutions running these things, in general, they're held to a sort of higher standard of accountability and transparency, and they don't. There's not as many problems with graft and politicization of these types of assets. And so I would say that Norway is probably the best economy in the world, if I had to say so. I think some of the things that Norway does well, number one, I think that their sovereign wealth fund is like incontrovertibly a good thing for their society. Alaska does the same thing. We have a US state that basically does the same thing as Norway, where what they do is they take resource rents, which is sort of unearned income, and taxes it and puts it into a collective pool of assets. And not only does this diversify the economy away from a very volatile commodity like oil, it also collectivizes to a large extent the returns to natural resources. And it's not really clear that any one person has the sole right to the resource rents associated with natural resources. And what this has done is it's created a wealth fund, which is worth about $270,000 for every single Norwegian adult and child. And that helps significantly with maintaining their economy. If you compare Venezuela to Norway, for instance, they both have state oil companies, but one of these countries collapses every time the oil price goes down, and one of these countries barely notices every time the oil price goes down. It's just good, responsible economic management. I think that their state owned enterprises are also good for a number of reasons. Again, I'm not like a heavy state ownership guy. I think I would focus more on government services and sovereign wealth fund ownership, but those are good things as well. And then cooperative ownership, again, it's just a matter of a strict preference. Like, I think one of the basic principles that I would have is that if society could be more egalitarian in terms of ownership and, let's say, income and wealth, but we don't see, great, sort of terrible outcomes for the economy in terms of growth and innovation, then again, it would be desirable to achieve a more equal economic system of production. I mean, there's just not like an intuitive reason to prefer inequality to equality if we assume that we can maintain technological advancement and like general economic growth, right? At least that's where I sort of come from.
In response to that, Blackwood?
So I guess I'll just address the second thing that was said first. When it comes to cooperative ownership, I think Econoboy actually really, really hit it on the head when he said this is more of a preference thing, right? Because when we're talking about things like equity or an egalitarian system, there's no right or wrong answer, in the math as to like which of these two is quote unquote better, right? Better is more of a normative statement of what kind of world do we want to live in, right? What kind of policies do we want to implement? And I I hate to go back to this example, but I'm going to keep on going back to it because I think it's funny, which is that the incel, like economic incelism, is incelism in of itself is very much focused on egalitarianism in the same right. It's this concept of, well, you have the top 1%, they're having all this sex and the rest of us aren't getting any. This is bullshit. We got to like make this equal. But the reason why I like this example even better is because it really highlights, even the most ardent leftist is going to hate this policy. I'm sure Econoboy is against like incels. Most of us, most reasonable people are. But the reason I think why it's such a good example is because it really highlights the fact that this equity comes at a price, right? This equity comes at taking or controlling somebody else's body, right? And all assets, uh, the rights to assets come from the labor that goes into them, and come from a complex series of contracts that make up any kind of capitalist society. So just simply saying, well, we got to make we got to make everything egalitarian. Um, you know, it depends on how it's done, right? If you're going to be using the government to collectivize things and to steal and redistribute people's property or bodies or their time or whatever, um, I think this is morally wrong, right? I have a strong dispreference towards this. I dislike this tremendously. If, on the other hand, you have some people get together and form a worker co-op, right, where they were like, let's all just get together and each own a company, like each own part of the company, because really all a worker co-op is a regular company, except ownership is restricted to its workers. I don't necessarily have a problem with that. I don't have an issue with that. I don't have an issue with consumer where the consumer is the owner of companies. So examples of that are like a mutual insurance company. I've got no problem with that, right? As long as it's set up in a consensual way. And I think that's kind of going to be my critical sticking point. Where if you want to set up these institutions to be like in a consensual manner, to be consensual, I have no problem with that. But the moment you start taking and demanding to use things that belong to somebody else, that's where you're going to run into a lot of issues with me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that again, I'm relatively outcome oriented, right? So I'm open to the idea that having a nearly entirely privatized sort of system of governance is a good thing. I think I said on my podcast recently that I think a lot of people they come to issues as their ideology, and then they map solutions onto issues, which is probably wrong. Rather, what I've done is I've tried to say basically, what does the research say in terms of outcomes for various things? Okay, the research says these things are probably good, and these things sort of cluster together, and that's why I call myself a SOCDEM. That seems to be where I kind of end up, right? And so the reason I mention that is because it seems like when you look into the empirical outcomes of welfare programs and like let's say well-run sort of governance models of ownership, like government services and state-owned enterprise and things like that, and sovereign wealth funds, of course, as well. You don't really seem to have a significant problem with graft or sort of political intrigue or anything like this into these programs. There's some level of scandals. Like when I was reading for this debate, I think I read that at some point Norway reformed their governance model. I want to say this was maybe in the 60s, where one of their state-owned enterprises had government bureaucrats on the board, and there was this big explosion at one of their plants, and so everyone kind of took a big kick in the pants politically from that. And so the politicians basically decided, well, we probably don't want to deal with this accountability. And it's also probably bad for governance. And so they made that reform to where basically people in the government couldn't also serve as directors of boards, even for state owned enterprises, right? And so there's all kinds of models that you can do to try and insulate these assets from political sort of vulnerability. And then when it comes to the outcomes of like welfare programs, I mean, even in the US, which has a very fragmented and very poor welfare system, I mean, if you look at the sort of after benefits poverty rates in the US, I have some statistics here from 1967 to 2020. Population poverty went from 18% to 11% in that period. That's about a 50% reduction. Childhood poverty went from 20% to 9.8%. It's about a 100% decrease, or no, that's a 50% decrease, I should say. Worker poverty, so poverty for workers, goes from 13.9 to 9%. And then elderly poverty goes from about 37.5% all the way down to 9.6%, right? And so these are all good things, right? I think it's good when people don't live in poverty. And again, insofar as we can provide transfers to people that don't harm economic growth, that don't hurt innovation, but actually bolster innovation, because oftentimes, I mean, how are you going to become an Einstein if you have no access to capital or education from a young age? Obviously, this is very bad for society. I would say that those programs are good. And I mean, if Lactoid, if you're willing to concede that, like, yeah, the studies show that these things are really, really good at reducing poverty, but I still would say that they're wrong. We can have that conversation, but the empirical conversation, I think, is, at least more important because at the end of the day, like, intuitively, every country on the planet has taxation and welfare programs. This is not a moral intuition that's shared by 99.9% of people. The idea that taxation is slavery, I'm enslaved when you tax me. I mean, again, if this was a broadly held intuition, we'd probably see governance be radically different than it is now. And at the very least, I would say also that there doesn't seem to be any movement towards this type of thing. So, like, what you might say is, oh, well, people used to think slavery was bad, and look at where we are now. And it's like, well, yeah, but it seems like the course of human history was a slow decoupling of slavery from the economy, which led to civil wars in some places and then also just reforms in other places to get rid of slavery. But when it comes to social spending and collectivization, it seems like the trends are quite the opposite. It seems like we have a massive growth from the early 1900s to today in the percentage of the economy that's dedicated towards social services. And of course, in many countries, the amount of collectivization, sort of democratic collectivization, let's say, in the economy. And so if you're willing to engage in the empirics, I'd love for you to do that. If not, then we can have this more philosophical debate.
I mean, we can do both. I think we got a little bit of time. I I have a couple responses. The first thing I'm going to say about the empirics is, yeah, I obviously I have opinions about the economy. There may be certain specific empirics that you may just know better, given your background. In the same way that I think if we had a debate on Roe v. Wade or something, that it would be I wouldn't expect you to have kind of come from the same base of knowledge. But one of the things I do is kind of look at other economists and maybe the negative way of saying this would be to parrot their opinion, but I let what they say inform my understanding of the economic issues here. If I'm not going to deny that if you give someone money, that's probably going to alleviate some of their poverty, at least in the short term. Because I mean, poverty by definition is just simply a state of not having, right? Incels are sexually impoverished. They're not having it. They're not getting the thing that they want, which is means they are sexually impoverished. Poverty is just something that we use to define people who fall below this threshold, in which now we say, okay, you don't have enough stuff, now we're just going to call you impoverished. And when you don't have stuff, like there's these negative outcomes that we don't like, and so we generally like to see people have more stuff. So I like people having stuff. I got no problem with people having stuff. It's just, again, the philosophical issue is going to be, well, how do you get people that stuff? And the manner of which you do so is, I think, critically important. I also think that there's a couple criticisms, perhaps, on the long term sustainability of welfare programs. Things like welfare cliffs, which, welfare cliffs specifically could be addressed in certain ways. Um, it is still, regardless, currently a risk in America.
Can you
And
define that for me? Welfare cliff. When you
so
say welfare cliff, what do you mean?
a welfare cliff would be someone who is not going to work because they make more money getting welfare than they do working. So in a lot of places, if you reach a certain income threshold, you lose access to government benefits, and the government benefits themselves maybe actually be more valuable than whatever money you're going to bring on, because it's a hard threshold. So you're going to want to, the ideal like min maxer is going to want to work and get just enough income to be $1 below what they can, whatever the threshold is, in order to qualify for the welfare program. So there's a very strong disincentive to work, and there's a very strong disincentive to try to expand your career path and to try to advance in life, because it's not in your financial well-being to do so. Why would you do so if you're going to lose out on benefits that are worth more than the $5 you would make extra if you put in, whatever $5 equivalent in extra work is.
Yeah, I would
Um,
say. Oh,
well,
sorry, you had more. Go for it.
yeah. I mean,
Dang, you can interrupt each other to a little degree, though, right? I do want this to be
Yeah,
like a
shut the
back and
fuck up, 𝕵𝖎𝖏. All right.
I
No, I'm
talked for
just
a while.
kidding.
Yeah, you can go ahead.
No, I mean, yeah, I guess to respond to that point, I mean, of course you're correct that in terms of welfare cliffs, this is a problem that can just be solved with program design, and to a
It could
large
be.
degree, it's a problem that doesn't really need to be solved by program design. And what I mean by that is that I think that oftentimes when people think of, so I think it's interesting. You're actually correct to point out that it's almost impossible for welfare to hurt people, in the sense that obviously all else equal, if you're poor and somebody gives you money, it's strictly speaking the case like you're probably not worse off. There are some edge cases of like, what if you're an incredible drug addict or something, and you get cash all of a sudden and you spend it all on drugs or something. But overwhelmingly the case is going to be that poor people who don't have enough money, that get money, they spend it responsibly. And this is well studied as well. When you give poor people money, they don't tend to spend it on crack and booze or whatever. They tend to spend it on housing and things like that. And um, and so a lot of people have this intuitive feeling that, well, like, hey, if we give people welfare, then people will quit working, right? And so that's obviously a big problem, because in order to fund welfare, we need people to work, because without workers, we don't have any sort of GDP, right? And so your tax base gets eroded by it. But the reality is, behind welfare, the philosophy behind welfare isn't necessarily to give money to like poor working people. That's part of it, sure. But the overwhelming number of welfare beneficiaries are people who are not workers, people who are not participating in the labor market, and people who, for various like moral reasons and social reasons, probably shouldn't participate in the labor market. So we're talking about retired people. I think that the budget, the U.S. federal government's budget, all the spending that they did in 2023, 30% of it was just Social Security and Medicare. 30% of every dollar that the U.S. government spent last year was just supporting elderly people, right? And I would say that that's a good use of money because I don't want elderly people to live in poverty. About 7% of that was actually spent on Medicaid, which is essentially healthcare for poor people. But other people, other groups of people that are overwhelmingly beneficiaries of the welfare state, people with disabilities, children, students, caregivers. Again, these are people who are not workers, right? And so there's no reason to be concerned about the labor market outcomes of supporting at least these people. Maybe you would say we shouldn't have unemployment insurance. Maybe you would say we shouldn't have food stamps for people who can work. Maybe, but you're only attacking at that point like 20, 30% of the entire welfare state. And in terms of the studies, at least, when you look at the effects of welfare and cash assistance to able bodied people, like, in theory, people who can work and adults, the evidence seems to show that to the extent that it does decrease your propensity to work, oftentimes it's disproportionately felt with certain groups of people, right? So oftentimes it's women in the house who have children. A lot of women will be stay at home mothers if they have the ability to get this cash assistance. A lot of women will become caregivers because now they have flexibility. What you find also is that a lot of children, especially in poor countries, so we're lucky because we're in a rich country to be fair, but in poor countries especially, welfare has much more magnitude in its effect because what you see is that children oftentimes get much more education. Mothers get much more access to prenatal care. And these are things that are all downstream good for the economy. I don't want children to grow up in poverty, in part for my own selfish desire to not have a bunch of illiterate adults growing up later in the future that are disproportionately criminals, disproportionately reliant on those same welfare systems. Having malnourished mothers and malnourished children and poor children is just in no way in any moral framework, I don't think, good for society. And again, so insofar as we can do those things that prevent those outcomes, we should do them. It appears that many countries have figured this out, including the United States. Again, those poverty rates have gone down substantially. So that's just kind of where I sit. I feel like insofar as we can prove that these programs alleviate poverty to an incredibly significant degree, it seems like it's very difficult to argue against them for most people, clearly, because almost every country has a sizable welfare state at this point that's in the developed world. But also, just sort of from a basic moral intuition perspective, very difficult to say that, we should cut these programs and, send these people basically back into poverty, right? I mean, it's really bad to do that, at least from my perspective, right?
I don't disagree that I'm in the minority when it comes to some of my more radical solutions, right? Where, yeah, because my focus is going to be so much more on people having rights over what their body and what flows from that. There's going to be situations where I'm not a big fan of Medicare or Social Security or these programs, but instead of me just saying the whole time that these are all equivalents to insulism, which I think they are, we can at least agree to some extent that these programs could be improved. You talked about how there's a program issue when it comes to welfare cliffs, and I actually agree with you. Where while I would like to see them removed, if we can't remove them, there's no political will to remove them. At the very least, there's some things we can do that to not make them just so like fucked in terms of the outcomes you see, where people the disincentive to work. When it comes to food stamps, right? We talked about how these poor people generally aren't spending irresponsibly. I'm not sure I agree with that, right? There's a strong correlation between economic class and engaging in activities such as cigarette smoking, right? Or the fact that with food stamps you can buy soda and cake and all that shit, but that doesn't really provide nutritional benefit. So I'm curious on that front. Like, let's just straight up with the food stamp question, because I've argued with people, in real life. I've argued with people who are like, yeah, of course you should be able to use food stamps to buy a soda, right? If you don't sell them, which a lot of people often go to do so they can buy other things. But um, do you agree that people should not be allowed to use food stamps to buy soda, junk food, et cetera? I mean, this probably also increases Medicaid spending in the long run due to the obesity epidemic. I don't understand why the government's insistent on paying for people's fudge rounds so they can put themselves in an early grave.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in part I would start with flipping the question on its head to some degree, right? Because like I believe in market distribution, right? I think markets are a very powerful tool to not only efficiently allocate capital, in this case money, but also in general, I think that intuitively it should be the case that people are free to spend their money how they wish. Now, that's an intuition that I have, but again, it seems like all the time when we talk about these conversations, it's like, oh, the $200 a month we give in food stamps to poor people, they might go around and spend it on fudge rounds. But we don't seem to talk about all the incredible wastes of money that rich people, spend their money on. Now, to some degree, you could say, well, hey, at the very least, it's rich people wasting their own money, or let's say other investors' money, right? But again, from a basic perspective, whether we have welfare or we don't have welfare, poor and rich people are going to waste their money in some ways, right? And so I'm not really sure that's a great argument against either subsidizing capital in form of investment. Like, I wouldn't say, oh, it's bad to have the tax equity credits that we give to solar energy companies because some of the returns to that capital go to rich people that waste their money on stupid shit. Like, that doesn't really make much intuitive sense to me. And then I would also say that it's just not really it's not empirically demonstrable that when you give poor people money, I mean, how many UBI experiments have there been alone? Like, forget about welfare programs, like actual experimentally designed UBI programs where you give a random set of people $500 a month, $1,000 a month, and you measure before and after their spending patterns or compare them to a control group. And you just simply don't see any sort of significant number of these people greatly increasing their spending, like you said, on things like fast food, cigarettes. There's going to be some marginal effects here and there. But what you see is that they tend to spend it on things like housing, right? That's the overwhelming biggest category that people spend their money on. And I don't think giving as well, I don't necessarily think the government should be in the business of like directly policing people's consumption habits. I mean, I think giving people cash is just empirically also a much more efficient way to administer welfare benefits. Anytime that we say poor people aren't allowed to buy X with their welfare, that's an administrative burden that we're putting on the state. And so I think that in a lot of regards, my ideal welfare system is a great debureaucratization of the government and quite a small government solution if you think about the sort of number of administrators that we're hiring and the number of bureaucrats that we're hiring.
Before you respond, I do have a donation for a question. Gang, get those in. If you super chat a question or if you give me enough bits, I'll read your question to these gentlemen when I get a chance. So I'm going to read the question later, right? But I want to let you know I have it. But I do have a question for 𝕾𝖍𝖎𝖙 in this, right? You talk
Yep.
about how rich people often will use their investors' money and things unwisely and things like that. As I understand it, and again, not an economist, if they continuously do that, they do lose their money. Investors stop investing in them. They, again, if they're consistently wasting this money and show not to provide a return on investment, they consistently lose that money. Is that incorrect?
Yeah, I mean, typically speaking, if you're a terrible investor of money, you'll probably lose those opportunities at some point, right?
Yes. So, given that, if again, consistently, someone who is getting government money, right, when the government's investing in them, and they continuously spend that money on things that are poor investments, right, and don't provide a return, would it not make sense for them to also lose their money?
Well, no, I wouldn't really say so because we have to think about the consequences in either system, right? So, like, when it comes to a poor person who wastes their welfare money, that person's still going to be materially poor, right? I mean, that's what they're losing in effect is the poverty effects of the program. If you want to take, $500 a month and spend it all on cigarettes, I mean, I guess your dumbass is free to do that. Now, I'm just saying that number one, 99% of poor people don't seem to do something like that. And number two, when we talk about the 1%, the consequence for them again is basically being poor still, right, and not being comfortable, right. And so, what I would say is that you have to weigh as well the effects of administration on the outcomes of the program, because what a lot of Republicans and like right wingers will say about these welfare programs is we have to have work requirements, we have to have application requirements, we have to have drug testing, we have to have regular visits with an administrative state, we have to have asset cliffs, we have to have income cliffs, and this is all in an effort to, like you said, reduce that. Like with food stamps, we have to have limits on what kind of food you can buy. This is all in an effort to police that sort of small minority of poor people who are irresponsible with the money that they get. And all that I would say is that I don't think punishing the other 98% of poor people who are good with their money that they get from the government is really worth like cracking down on this 2%, especially because what it seems is you don't typically get like poor people changing their behaviors significantly, even that small minority that wastes their money. What you just get is a lot more like well-intentioned poor people just falling out of the programs because of all these different requirements. And that again is not quite a moral outcome. In my universe, yeah, there's probably more poor people who like smoke cigarettes or something because some of them buy more cigarettes with it. But there's also like way less generalized poverty, way less financial destitution overall. And overall, I mean, just a significantly larger percentage of poor people who are able to have a little bit more breathing room in their budgets.
Let me just ask you quick clarifying question. So when we're talking about food stamps specifically, are you proposing removing the removing food stamps and simply replacing it with a sort of UBI? Would that UBI be dependent on income, or would it truly be like a UBI where everyone gets it?
Yeah, I mean, I think our most recent episode on our podcast was about UBI and how we would structure such a program. I did a simple program of just people above the age of 18. I would say that in terms of a practical proposal, you're probably never going to get like a true UBI. So practically speaking, you're probably going to step ladder it with income. Like for every dollar you make in income, you lose 30 cents of this benefit. That way, you're always incentivized to keep working or something like that. And that's simple because income is easier to measure than all these other weird tests that the government does. But in my ideal system, yeah, we would probably have a substantial sort of UBI that we gave to people, and we'd probably have substantially less sort of in-kind benefits, or like call it like constrained cash benefits like food stamps, or call it quasi-cash benefits like food stamps.
So in terms of the general proposition of when you make more money, that the reduction of welfare should be proportionate with the amount of money that you make. I don't disagree with that in terms of it being like a pragmatic solution now, because obviously you're right that I don't have the political power to institute my glorious libertarian republic yet. Maybe that'll happen someday. I'm skeptical personally myself. But until then, we obviously need to find ways to remove as many of the disincentives that welfare creates, and hopefully reduce as much of the damage that I think it creates. When we're talking about being
Just
able to
real quick, can
spend the
you
money,
elaborate on that damage? You
yeah,
keep
stealing
kind of
money from people. It all comes back to this idea of like it's a redistribution, right?
okay.
Where
Thievery wick.
yeah, thievery. You're taking from Peter to pay Paul. Um, and in some cases, like Social Security, I think it's very directly comparable to a Ponzi scheme. That taking from Peter to pay Paul is a common phrase used to refer to Ponzi schemes. But when it comes to food stamps specifically, or really any kind of welfare, I think you said something interesting that I take a lot, and I think really highlights one of the philosophical differences we have, which is, what about the rich people who spend their money? I don't really want to be in the business of policing how people spend their money. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that's more or less what you said. And I just fundamentally, I don't see it as their money, right? This is like the fundamental difference. If you get rich as hell and you blow your money on dumb shit, or you make some really bad investment decisions,
I mean,
and
I would agree. Just to, I don't know
yeah,
if you if there's I would agree that a person receiving welfare, it's not like their money in the sense that they worked for it, right? This is a collective pool of money. I'm just saying it's their money at the point of being granted to them, right? I wouldn't like claw back cash benefits at any point, right? So
well, but we can, when we give things to people, we can obviously attach contractual obligations to how that's used, right? When your bank gives you a mortgage, you can't just take that money and like figure out a way to like go blow it at slots in Las Vegas, right? You have to spend that money on a house. If you get a car loan, you have to spend that money on a car. That's a contractual obligation of the money. Now the food stamps are created with with the idea of, well, uh, there's poor people in America who need food, right? They need nutritional supplementation. And so,
right.
in order to give them food, we're going to give them these food stamps, right? But there's already restrictions that we put in that I think are pretty common sense. We don't let them buy cigarettes with food stamps. We don't let them buy alcohol, despite the fact there are arguably calories in alcohol. You could, try to twist that, but we don't let them buy alcohol because that's like antithetical to even the purpose of food stamps. And so, um, let me just ask you this: if we kept food
Hmm.
stamps, let's say we didn't go to the UBI system, would you allow people to use their food stamps on alcohol? And if not, why wouldn't you also apply this to like Coca-Cola?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would. Alcohol is an interesting case. I would say that most states and municipalities, and I guess I don't know if there's a federal tax on alcohol or not, but it seems like there's already disincentives to purchase things like alcohol, and that's kind of where I would line up from the wonky perspective, which is to say that um, I don't think it's necessarily good for anybody to purchase alcohol. It's not good for poor people or for like wealthy people. Alcohol doesn't seem to, like, at least in excess, right? Alcohol doesn't seem to be good for you, right? Same thing with cigarettes. And this is why, again, like I mean, I don't know, there's very few government entities on the local, sort of provincial, federal, national level that don't have this sort of disincentive of buying things like alcohol, cigarettes, marijuana, um, a lot of, places, sugar, red meat, whatever it is. And so my argument in this regard is mostly going to come in the form of an efficiency argument that, to answer your question directly, I would say, yeah, if in a way that I would alter the food stamp program, it's like, hey, here's a food card. How whatever the test would be, if you buy it in a grocery store and it's a consumable, perishable, non-perishable product, you can buy it. That would include alcohol. Um, because that's just a little bit more efficient, right? What we've seen is that governments don't have actually an incredible ability to monitor or to design programs that are actually good at accomplishing both goals at once. Again, the goal number one, in theory, is reduce these sort of frivolous consumption choices of poor people. Goal number two of a welfare program is alleviate poverty, right? So those are the two goals in theory if you're designing a program this way. And it seems like all the tests that we do to prevent poor people from spending their money in certain ways or from qualifying to access certain money in certain ways, it seems like all those tests lead to is huge bureaucratization, a lot of government bureaucrats collecting checks, and collecting retirement benefits when they retire, a lot more government agency overreach, a lot more invasion of poor people's privacy and invasion of their time, measurable and immeasurable sort of benefits, negatives, let's say. But what we also see is less poverty being alleviated because so many people say to themselves, I don't want to deal with all that bullshit. Or I fell out of the program because of one various weird test that they put me through. Like, I don't know, I smoked marijuana and Florida has a drug test for their, food stamps or something like that, right? And again, it's a values judgment. Like, what's the net benefit here? I would say that the net benefit, the best maximizing net benefit world is the world where you broadly give people money and allow them to consume the way that they see fit. Alleviates poverty greatly. They don't tend to waste their money overall. And yeah, some people end up wasting the money. Like, that's a better world to me than the world where we greatly reduce welfare recipients, and therefore greatly increase poverty. But sure, there's marginally less people who are, I guess, able to, to buy cigarettes and alcohol. That's just sort of the intuition that I have. I mean, in your worldview, genuinely speaking, like, which world would you prefer? I assume you'd prefer the world just with less welfare because you're, well, with less welfare, there's less stealing. But again, consequentially, I just feel like that's unsatisfying for me and most people. The idea that, yeah, there's less poor people smoking cigarettes, but there's a lot more of them in poverty. That's kind of where I'm coming from on questions like that.
Well, this is kind of where, yeah, obviously, I prefer the world in which there's no welfare, but this is kind of along the lines of what I've been talking about. Where, I mean, obviously, as a libertarian, I'm politically losing. As a what you think you said, social democrat or democratic socialist, in America, at least, I would argue you're also somewhat politically losing. I mean, you got Bernie, I suppose, but he's not winning. And so, yeah, there's like somewhere in the middle that I think that like the political mindset of America lies, where there is like a skepticism of taxation in America. I think if you tax people enough, they definitely feel as though they're stolen from. I don't know if the common person's going to consider it to be theft in the same way, but I can usually walk them through the argument, and at the end, they'll usually agree with me that it's theft. But regardless, they still hate the fact that they're losing their income. And this middle road here, I think, is honestly like pretty reasonable and prudent, which is that if we're going to have food stamps, there should absolutely, if you're going to get this free money from the government, or from the taxpayers, really, if you're going to get other people's money, at the very least, it's reasonable for us to put restrictions on what you can spend it on. Because if you do spend it on alcohol and cigarettes and soda and chips and cookies and fudge rounds and all that stuff, this does a couple things, right? It first of all eliminates the purpose, or at least reduces the purpose of this program, because you're not that shit's not nutritious, right? You're supposed to be supplementing your nutrition. But second of all, it contributes to a obesity epidemic, which people in America are already having an issue with, and especially poor people. And generally, we don't want to tell people what they can or can't buy, whether it be shitty food or alcohol or whatever, because of that important like individual freedom aspect. But we're not infringing upon somebody's individual freedom if we say, okay, like you can choose to get this free money, but you have to spend it under XYZ circumstances. That's not an infringement of their liberty, because they are free to say no. So when they take that money, you can simply like, okay, now you're going to take this money. You got to spend that on healthy food. You can't waste it on shit that's going to like raise our Medicare and Medicaid costs in the long run, which is like another unintended consequence of this, of allowing this shit. And when you're healthier, you're more likely to be able to get a job, and get off the system. You know, maybe this can also help with the rates of disability payments we make, because a lot of disability payments are due to obesity and its side effects. To me, like banning fast or unhealthy food from being bought with food stamps is just a no-brainer, right? It helps reduce a lot of the negative effects we see here, and we have the right to do it, given that it's stolen money, and we get to decide how it's going to be spent anyway, or the kind of the restrictions on it. And we already do have some restrictions, so obviously we can restrict it further. Um, and
Well,
you know,
just keep in mind though, for every this is something that I want to for people to keep in mind with these kinds of means tests and sort of cliffs like that you're talking about, things like drug testing and restricting the amount of things people can do with their money. I to me, every government bureaucrat should be productive, right? Teachers should be teaching students. To the extent that we have administrators in schools, they should be providing serious value to the school. Bureaucrats administering welfare benefits are amongst the most unnecessary spending that the government does. Right? It's the most bureaucratic of bureaucracies. The idea of we're going to hire a bunch of people to determine whether or not you fit the 28 different requirements and whether or not you're spending your money appropriately in terms of designing this program in general, right? And so, for a libertarian minded person, I'm just not sure that it's clear that one is like strictly better than the other, right? I've heard many libertarians argue that UBI is actually the libertarian thing to do, right? Cash benefits are the libertarian thing to do for this very reason. The idea that you put more means tests on these programs, well, you're going to end up hiring more government bureaucrats, right? And so, on one hand, you could say, well, we're spending more on Medicaid and Medicare because there's some marginal increase, like 1% of poor people are X% fatter or something after we unrestrict these programs. But we're also spending a lot more on government bureaucrats and government bureaucrat benefits and pensions later on down the line because we're hiring so many more bureaucrats to administer these programs. And so, I think that if we're starting from the premise that welfare is not going away, and the second premise is how can we make welfare more efficient? Those are sort of the two premises that you offered up earlier. It's really not clear to me that you'd prefer, unrestricted cash benefits from a libertarian perspective, or basically these more restricted, bureaucratically managed benefits.
This is a debate within libertarian circles. I don't deny that. A lot of people, in fact, a lot of economists that I hold in very high regard, right, Milton Friedman being one, and several others, have talked a lot about how UBI and how it can be effective in certain circumstances over other kinds of welfare programs. And I think those arguments are interesting, and I'm not necessarily discounting them. Um, the question for me is going to be one of just where I'm sitting on like my evaluation of the overall cost comparison, right? And this is somewhat informed where a lot of state, you talk about the drug testing requirements for a lot of welfare, where, well, so in my state, for example, they did implement drug testing requirements, and they caught some very small amount of people. Right? It was when you actually average out the cost of like administering the drug test and drug testing, as opposed to just banning like somebody from using food stamps from buying specific products. I think drug testing is a much more bureaucratically heavy system, right? Because you actually have to do the drug testing, et cetera, et cetera. Meanwhile, with the other one, you can just, here is what you're not allowed to buy, and then put it on the grocery stores just to comply. Don't let you people buy this product with the food stamps. I think that'd be easier. But even with drug testing, for example, yeah, it's true that the actual people who got caught, and then lost the benefits, like that number alone wasn't that didn't make up for the cost of hiring all that extra bureaucracy and engaging all that extra bureaucracy. But when you factor in the cost of all the people who didn't apply, because a lot of people who knew they would test positive for drugs and they just didn't apply, when you calculate that cost, it was a overall savings, right? It was an overall savings to the taxpayer. So, like that's an example of where a libertarian who's like very concerned with government expansion, and I am concerned with government expansion, so I get that side of the argument. And for some things that may just be, I might even agree with them, right? But for this in particular, when I think it would be very bad to just like replace food stamps with a direct check that they can use to buy, to spend irresponsibly, right? To buy cigarettes, alcohol, bad food, et cetera, and put themselves in a situation where they're going to continue to be a burden in the state in other ways going forward through healthcare costs and disability payments. I prefer just to cut that to cut that problem at the beginning, right? No, you got to buy chicken and broccoli going forward with the food stamps if you want to buy anything at all with the food stamps. And now you weigh 50 pounds less, and you're got a job instead of the current situation, which I think is worse.
Well, sure. I mean, I think this comes down to because some socialists will say that in-kind benefits are better than cash benefits because in-kind benefits are decommodification, whereas cash benefits are not, right? And again, I think it's, I guess to some degree, it depends on how sort of maybe small L libertarian you are in regards to how you might design government programs, right? If we imagine, like for instance, if we imagine two programs, right, where we have one program where we just decide that we're going to just build a bunch of houses, like build a bunch of government houses because people need housing, so we're going to build a bunch of houses, or we're going to give people, let's say $1,200 a month in cash, and you can spend that money on however you want, and if you want to, I would say do both, frankly, but if you had to pick between one or the other in terms of the sort of cost to the state, um, it would seem to me that the sort of frivolous cost to the state would be all the administrators that would go into building out a program like that, not necessarily the small amount of ministers to distribute those cash benefits. Now, it's true that on like a dollar perspective, so one thing you mentioned is, well, we end up with net savings to the taxpayer because a lot of people drop off of their welfare benefits. Like, I wouldn't necessarily, I mean, how could I disagree with that? You kick a bunch of people off of welfare, you're going to spend less on welfare, right? I mean, that's pretty intuitive, right? I mean, of course that's the case, right? But it's a matter of, well, what's the sort of trickle up effect of that, right? Because again, when people are in poverty, they can't innovate, right? When people are in poverty, they don't go to education as much. When people are in poverty, they don't go to training as much. When people are in poverty, I mean, this has been shown that if you're in poverty, it's harder to get a job, right? It's just harder to do things when you're poor, right? And when you smooth out people's incomes or you provide a basic standard of living, do both obviously, but if you do one or the other, you find that those types of symptoms are alleviated, right? So what's the true cost of kicking people off welfare? I think it's much greater than, the amount of tax receipts that you're saving. Another thing that I would mention is that there was an article from Matt Bruning called Universal Programs Cost Less Than Means Tested Programs. And the argument that he makes in that is that the accounting cost from the government's perspective of a means tested program, let's say that we give everyone $500 a month, and for each dollar you earn, the benefit decreases by a dollar or whatever. So at the point that you make $6,000 a year, you're not receiving any benefits anymore. His point is that obviously providing a means tested $500 a month benefit is cheaper to the government than providing $500 a month to every single adult. But when we think about the basicness of this basic cash assistance, everyone on the planet, I'll say on the planet, but let's just say in our country specifically, the United States, everyone in the United States needs probably at least $500 a month to just live as a human being in America, right? That there truly speaking, there is some minimum level of income that you need to live as a person in this country. And so by giving somebody, everyone $500 a month, all you're doing is transferring the private distribution of those dollars to the public, right? So it's not clear that the dollars dedicated to achieving your basic standard of living have actually increased, right? Rather, you've just changed the administrative agent of those dollars. And so it's a question of who's better to guarantee that everyone receives a basic standard of living? Is it the private market and private actors, or is it the government with its power of taxation? And in that regard, of course, it's the case that government through welfare spending can guarantee a basic standard of living to people more effectively than private actors in the private market. It's not clear that charity has ever been an effective way to alleviate poverty. Poverty persists even in the face of these state benefits, and it need not in the face of so much cash in corporate treasuries and people's bank accounts. I mean, in theory, we could provide enough charity to give everyone a basic standard of living. It just doesn't happen. So practically speaking, it seems like these programs alleviate poverty for administratively relatively little cost. And those are I guess the two things that I would really look for in terms of the effectiveness of a welfare state. Again, when we implement welfare, poverty goes down, inequality goes down. There's not significant effects on growth and unemployment, depending on basically you could create a welfare program that destroys the economy, obviously. But there's better and worse designed welfare programs and ways to fund them. So those are just the systems that I would advocate for.
On this one, it's going to be just it's going to be like a empirically driven position
You're
where
yeah.
if you can show me a specific program where we sit down and go over all of the potential downstream effects, and it comes out that the hiring these government bureaucrats actually is more of a waste on this like specific program than just giving the money directly. I can buy into it. I'm just skeptical about this when it comes to food stamps.
Okay.
Well, yeah, food stamps specifically. Yeah, Wick, what do you have to say?
Now we're
This
just a
isn't your
little
show. Come on.
circling the drain a little bit on this one, right? And I want to get to some audience questions.
Wait,
Let's
can you
do
read
it.
the audience? Can you read the audience questions for Econoboy while I go pee?
Yes, I
All
will.
right.
Let's do it.
Okay, so while he
How much water does
redistributes
this man
his
drink?
urine.
This is his second pee break in an hour, people.
Fuck.
You weren't here pre-show.
Man's gotta do what a man's gotta do. Talk
There
about
you go.
sugary drinks and all that. Really goes for you. Okay, so this was from Average Debate Enjoyer, and he asks this. When
Average
you
debate
get to a
enjoyer.
good point, I want to ask about Econoboy's definition of socialism. He basically said any firm controlled by the government regardless of form. So is every army in existence a result of socialism? Is the lack of a state the exact opposite of socialism? I think his definition is silly.
Well, no, I mean, not really. And my definition's not really silly if you understand sort of the foundations of socialist thought, right? I mean, socialism in its most basic foundation is collective ownership, right? Collectively owned things, right? And so if you're talking about the military, right? At first glance, it appears quite odd to say, "Oh, the military is a socialist institution." Because we just don't tend to think of, for some reason, we don't tend to think of productive entities the government owns as socialism if it's in America. But if we think of productive entities owned by the government in places like Cuba or China, we think of that as socialism. So intuitively, I understand it stretches most people's imagination. Most people don't know what socialism is, and that's why it stretches the imagination. Again, the reality is we could have a private market distributed defense market. We could do that. We could privatize our defense industry. But we don't have a privatized defense industry in bulk. We have a socialized defense industry in bulk that provides GDP and services to us as a people. It's a collective entity that's owned by the government and operated by the government, accountable democratically to the people. And while some people would say, because, oh, but I'm a right wing Republican, I love the police. Does that make me a socialist? Well, no, again, I'm not calling you a socialist if you think things like the military or the police are right. I believe in those things and I don't call myself a socialist, right? But if you get to the point where, you believe that like 95% of the economy should be organized with collectivist institutions, yeah, you're probably a socialist. But if you just believe in things like the police and public schools, well, you're probably not a socialist. You just believe in some forms of collective ownership.
I want to respond to this as well, if I could, and
Yeah.
actually agree very strongly with a lot of what Econoboy just said, which is that average debate enjoyer. I love you, man, but I actually do somewhat agree that the military is socialized, right? And I don't take umbrage with Econoboy's definition, but I want to ask a direct question then, where there was a common meme. It stemmed from Richard Wolff of where, well, when you raise taxes, it's just more socialister. But arguably, I think under the definitions we're talking about, raising taxes is more socialist than lowering taxes because you're implementing a collectivization, right, of the economy, the productive economy, by removing a portion of the output and redistributing it through the government. So would
Mhm.
you disavow Richard Wolff when he makes fun of people who point out that taxes are socialism?
Well, it kind of depends, right? Because some socialists would say socialism isn't just collective ownership; it's collective ownership and decommodification. So if you view socialism as requiring decommodification, then I feel like it's easier to grant the idea that taxes and spending are a form of socialism because they decommodify things, right? You know, when you give, when you tax $1 trillion out of the economy and then you use it to build houses, you're contributing to the decommodification, the sort of less than fully market allocated housing, you know, sort of distribution of houses, let's say, right? And so you could make that argument. I would just say that it seems like when you look into the history of socialism and socialist movements, yes, well, like typically socialists will argue for welfare. Even Karl Marx, he said that he had a quote something like, well, you have to have enough money for administration, which is to say you have to have money for the government, you have to have money for poor relief, which is welfare in his view, and then you give the rest of the money to the workers, right? So he didn't believe in complete worker autonomy over production. Even he said you probably need government administration and you need poor relief in general, right? So that could be socialist. I just think of it more as collective ownership. I don't think that early socialist thinkers really took an incredibly strong view on that. It seems like the biggest thing that they were concerned about was ownership of capital and production. And that's what I would say. I mean, Richard Wolff just what he's making fun of, I think, is the idea that if the government does a thing, then it's socialism, right? You'll see some libertarians who say that, if the government does anything, that means we have a socialist economy. Fabian Liberty has said this. He says, I have a one drop rule. One drop of socialism, it's all socialism. But that, I mean, just intuitively, again, that just doesn't really make much sense, right? I mean, if you have a 99% privatized economy and you have like courts, police, and the military, does that make your whole society social? Like, no, of course not. That doesn't really make much sense to me, and I don't think generally that's any sort of way to advocate.
So the ANCAP I was talking about that calls me a socialist is Fabian Liberty Scott. So
Oh,
He's
I
okay.
guess
coming on tomorrow,
I
gang.
have that I have that drop. I'm sure, according to him. So I believe you when that's what he says his opinion is.
Yeah.
But I see it as I'm going to disagree about some of what you said, but also agree. I see socialism as more of it's like a heuristic, very similar to the term liar, right? If you lie once, are you less honest than somebody who never lies? I would say yes, right? But if you lie once in your life, would I consider you to be a liar? Does one crime a criminal make? Probably not, right? It's a heuristic that we use to just like define somebody who, well, they've reached this
Well, what if I
point in which.
stab just one baby? Okay, am I a baby
Right. Well,
murderer?
you're right. Like if the action is like sufficiently egregious enough, then we're more comfortable, right? If you fuck one goat, you're a goat fucker. But if you work every day in your life, it's like, or for work for 10 years, are you really a worker? I don't know. It's like this is why I'm calling it a heuristic. It's very much viewpoint dependent where socialism begins and where it ends. But at the very least, I think that while that may be some kind of subjective determination whether or not something has reached enough socialism to be considered socialist. I think I personally think it's inarguable that taxes, like when the government does something, I would say it is more socialister than when the government doesn't do something. Because what is it, right? As long as you have a government that is a collective, which the government is, then moving resources into the government and then them, doling it out or spending it on certain programs would absolutely be socialist. And if it gets to a certain point, then we would all agree that that is like a socialist government. You talked about how if the government took money, like and decommodified housing by building housing. Yeah, I wouldn't disagree that'd be socialist, but like a reduced form of that, like Section 8, is more socialist than if there wasn't a Section 8 because you're decommodifying housing at least some percentage, right? You're decommodifying some housing, some percentage in order to fit a certain social goal. If you, subsidize healthcare through Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, this is obviously more social. There's a reason why, like in the 1930s, right? Like, who were the big proponents of Social Security? The socialists, right? It was absolutely a socialist program. Now you're not going to get boomers to agree with that, especially not Republican boomers, because they love Social Security because they're happen to be now on the tail end of the Ponzi scheme and they really don't want to lose their investment. I get that, right? But if we're being honest with ourselves, of course, having Social Security is more socialist than not having Social Security. Of course, taxes are more socialist than not having taxes. So, to the extent that Scott is saying like one drop makes you a socialist, I would agree that one drop makes you more socialist than if you didn't have that drop. But would I call somebody who jaywalked a criminal? Probably not.
Okay. $2 from Testicle Johnson. Uh, please explain. Please don't go into super detail. We got some more to cover. I got more questions. Please explain and give opinion on the gold standard.
Yeah, sure. Gold standard. The gold standard's bad because it's rigid and because generally it constrains economic growth. And it's also not clear, especially if you look into the history of the gold standard, it's also not clear that the gold standard actually leads to generalized levels of price stability. It does lead to a lot more periods of deflation, and you could say like average prices were more stable. But if you have 10% inflation and then 10% deflation within like a 5-year period, just for example, that's probably not net good for the economy. The best thing for the economy, to a large degree, is stability. And so the sort of great moderation, and when central banks really took the reign of managing inflation, it seems like what you see across the world when central banks do that, when they get rid of the gold standard and they start taking inflation seriously with interest rates, what do you see? You see much more stable and low inflation, and that's probably desirable to the alternative, if you ask me.
Lactoid, same question to you, sir.
I'm not a gold bug. I think so. Very similar to like rent control and anti like when a disaster happens, laws against price gouging. This is like my understanding is this is a subject in which both sides of the economics aisle are sort of in agreement, which is that this is probably not the best idea. And there's like a fringe minority of people who like really, really back this idea. Do I think inflation is kind of another kind of a hidden form of taxation? I do. But the gold standard doesn't really fix that because that would also mean that the inflation would also correlate with just how many gold resources you mined and like or discovered. I mean, going way back, you saw this happen with the Spanish Empire when they started mining a fuck ton of silver. Well, inflation because silver dropped almost all of its value because there was just so much of it. I would prefer there be probably not a gold based currency, but a very stable currency that would not have, rapid inflationary or deflationary effects, which is not what we currently have, right?
No,
We have
that gets
Jerome
into
Powell
don't
print a bunch of shit.
don't cuck me on my next question. But yeah,
Oh, my bad.
no, it's okay because I think we've talked about welfare a lot, right? And we've touched on socialized economies, but I want to kind of take it from the clouds and get down to brass tacks, right, on the ground, um, what we see. I guess I'll just ask you both. Um, Under Joe Biden, how's the economy been? What's your leanings there? We're gonna start with lactoid. And we're gonna economy. How do you think Joe Biden has been a good steward of his presidency? Not just with the economy, but in general. What are your thoughts, lactoid?
I've said this before. Based on the research that I've read, there was a couple studies done on this, and who the president is has almost no bear. Like there could be like some tangential effect in the economy. There's almost no effect. Now, that study was done before the reaction to the pandemic, so perhaps that could have changed, right? The direction to print money was like a higher order, government decision. Now, a lot of that came under Trump, and a lot of that came under Biden. So, that absolutely could have a pretty major effect on the economy that I think is bad. But like other than like kind of black swan events, people like to say, well, the party is what determines the economy. People vote on party based on like what they want the economy to be currently. The economy is so complex and there's so many things in play that it's hard to credit one person with being or even the president with having so much of an effect on the economy. That all being said, again, we were just off the tail of a black swan event, and I think you see Biden take credit, or basically say what I just said when the economy's going to shit. When you see gas prices expanding, Biden saying, "Well, I don't control the gas prices," which he's probably somewhat right on. And when, like, inflation's rising, well, that was Trump, not me. Typical politician. And then when the economy happens to recover from the pandemic, or you happen to see certain a growth in the stock market, which you are seeing a rebound in the stock market, you're going to see him take credit for it. Do I think Biden's policies have been particularly effective on, like, rebounding the economy? No. And I think that both Trump and Biden, with the money printing, I think Jerome Powell even admitted that they fucked up when it came to the money printing. I think they both really, with the inflation, really fucked over Americans. And I think the inflation is out of control. Definitely was out of control. And if you have, again, the chairman of the Fed saying that he fucked up, I'm willing to take him at his word.
Oh boy, same question.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that an individual president doesn't like necessarily have the ability to. I mean, to be fair, necessarily the president could destroy the economy. He could nuclear bomb like a bunch of major cities or something. But like, generally speaking, the president doesn't enact such widespread control over the economy. But certainly, the president does set sort of. Let's say set the agenda, right, and set the tone of policy discourse, especially in a unified government. Of course, we can compare the first 2 years of Trump in terms of economic policy and economic philosophy to the first 2 years of Biden, and sort of see where they come to. Or you could even compare the last 2 years of Trump to the first 2 years of Biden, where they each had the opportunity to design sort of their own COVID relief package and see what the sort of main differences were, right? And I would say that in general, Trump has taken a significantly less austere approach to Republican politics than many other Republicans that were in office. Trump was running trillion-dollar deficits before the pandemic, right? So certainly not quite as scared to deficit spend in Trump's administration, even during an economic expansion. He was calling for the Federal Reserve to reduce interest rates, even in a period when inflation was pretty low, right? So, sort of a classic, almost like Latin American style populist. Just spend the money into the economy if that's what it takes to grow the economy. Who gives a shit, right? Which was kind of funny. But I think that in form, right, Trump is gonna, he's gonna do things that acquiesce a little bit more to the right in terms of economic outlook. He's going to cut taxes for wealthy people. He's going to try and reform welfare to be a little bit more restrictive, things like this. He's going to try and offload state assets to some degree if he can. And I would say that generally speaking, this is probably not a good thing. I say that if you look at the first 2 years of Biden, let's look at some of the things that he did. He greatly expanded the welfare state, at the very least for his first year, where he had the ARP and the child tax credit. This was something that reduced childhood poverty significantly because, like Lactoid said, poverty is just a lack of income, right? And so increasing, welfare spending is going to decrease poverty. So this is probably a good thing. He did certain sort of industrial policy, which I would agree with. Things like the CHIPS Act, things like the IRA was essentially just a big industrial policy bill which subsidized renewable energy and sustainable development. These are good things because climate change is going to kill us all one day if we don't do anything about it sometime soon. So I think the biggest investment in clean energy in American history, that's probably, like I've said before, if all Joe Biden did was pass the IRA, that's a pretty big accomplishment, right? But he didn't just do that, right? He had the CHIPS Act, he had the ARP, he had the IRA, all these other things, whatever, as well. So I would say that that's probably a good direction to go in versus Trump and the right wingers. The economy today seems to be doing decently enough. We've had consumer sentiment tick up as inflation's gone down, as employment's maintained its current levels. Wage growth seems to be ticking up as well. So I don't know. Things seem to be looking pretty good.
Just a couple clarifications. So, if this was hinted, I thought it was hinted, but if it's not, correct me. I agree with the hinting that when we're asked how the economy is doing, a big question is, how is the economy doing for who? If you expand the welfare state, obviously this is going to serve the interests of people on welfare. So, I mean, by that metric, sure, right? Biden, to the extent that Biden expanded the welfare state, obviously I disagree with that economic action for the reasons we've already talked about. And I just want to make sure I clarify this. When I said that when you give impoverished people money, you alleviate their poverty, I specified, in the short term, and I want to just really maintain that. I don't want people after this panel saying, well, lactoid is basically Stalin. No, like I'm skeptical as to how welfare can actually alleviate poverty in the long term, in terms of, again, like work distance, disincentivizing work, specifically, but also the ramifications on the economy when you remove money from one place and put it into another. There's a question as to what effect that has. So another thing that you see Biden doing is taking money from, stealing money from people and giving it to college grads. Right? That's a sure good for whom? Yeah, great for college, for people with college debt. But you're with people with college debt specifically. Now I know that his relief has been income uh, gradiented, which is better. Is somewhat means tested, which I think is better than just forgiving all college debt, because college debt is primarily held by people who have high income potential, obviously, because they went to college and they got a degree disproportionately. So the initial Biden plans, before it was struck down by the Supreme Court, of just forgiving tens of thousands of dollars in, $10,000 per person and like $20,000 per couple of college debt, sure, that'd be great for them. But in terms of, first of all, it's a handout to the rich, just straight up, right? A direct money transfer to the rich, essentially. But also, you know, it's just when you take out a loan, the idea of, well, if enough people are irresponsible with their loans, then it becomes like a problem. And now we're going to, use stolen money to alleviate that problem. I don't like that. So there's a bunch of things that Biden's doing for the economy that I just don't like. But I'm not going to deny that, of course, they're going to be good for some people who have different goals than I do, because that's how politics works.
Okay. I guess the what I'm trying to, maybe I didn't phrase it properly, right? Recently,
Oh
there's
no.
been a lot of debate, both on the left and the right, over how the economy is doing. Right? There are a lot of people who say that the economy is still in the shitter. It's not improving. The lives of the poor are still not being um, improved by any of these policies, etc. Though there is people fighting against that. People who are saying that the economy is much better now. Inflation's on the decrease, etc., etc., etc. I guess I'm just asking where you both fall on that debate. Does that make
I
sense?
mean, my position on this is, I don't know, it's been somewhat nuanced because I think that for I think it's reasonable to understand how both narratives could sort of exist at the same time. When you look at inequality over time, right? What you'll see is that inequality over time in the U.S. it's gone up, right? So sort of relatively speaking, poor people aren't quite as sort of wealthy as rich people are, right? But the thing is, people don't realize that this is true at every level of the income distribution. So when you look at bottom 10% people and their wage growth over time compared to bottom 20%, compared to bottom 30%, compared to bottom 40, all the way up until you get to top 1%, top 0.1%, top 0.01%, the scale of increase in pay has disproportionately gone up at every level of income. So somebody who's 50th percentile has substantially made more money, or like the 50th percentile person is wealthier and has had more income growth than the 40th percentile person, than the 30th percentile, than the poorest person, right? And so the reason I think that both of these narratives exist at the same time is that for a long time, um, although you can point to statistics that show that like the median income is rising, and median income going up is a good thing, right? It means that obviously the median person is doing better. Um, but it also means that to a large degree, poor people are actually much worse off. That like poor people in this country, in terms of their income that they get. So we're talking about working people. We're not talking about people who qualify for benefits. And that's an important distinction because again, you can show that poverty rates have gone down substantially. But what does that look like for working poor people, right? Who don't necessarily qualify for as much welfare as non-working poor people. And so you might have a poor person who was poor 20 years ago who's still considered poor today, but they're even poorer, right? Because they simply haven't gotten, a 20% increase in their pay over time. They've maybe gotten a 5% increase in their pay over time. And so that's something worth taking seriously, that it's possible for the economy to be good for a majority of people, but also for the economy to be quite bad for a minority of people. And this is where the Biden economy, I think, has been especially advantageous because what we've seen is that trend is actually broken over these last few years. That because of the tight labor market, lower income workers have disproportionately experienced pay increases. lower income workers have experienced relatively low levels of unemployment compared to higher income workers, at least in a relative sense, right? And so, and that coupled with the relatively generous welfare schemes of the Biden early administration, had meant that, that in conjunction, I'm sorry, with also the Trump relief meant that we had the lowest inequality. People don't realize how much stimulus we did. We had the lowest levels of income inequality in like 45 years. That's how much stimulus we did to the economy, again, which disproportionately benefits lower income people. And so that's one of the reasons, again, I would say that the Biden economy is actually pretty strong, is that we've had this trend of lower income people getting fucked for a long time. And it seems like because of the tight labor market, because of, and I'm saying the Biden economy, not necessarily crediting every single one of these metrics purely with Biden's policy, but like it just seems like people do the opposite where, like Lactoid said, Biden says when the economy's good, I did that. When the economy's bad, I didn't do that. Well, people do the opposite as well. When the economy's bad, Biden did that. When the economy's good, well, that must have been a Trump policy that's actually just carried over into Biden's administration. That's really naive, right? But the economy's pretty good right now for most people, and it's getting better for poor people as well, which I would say is good.
So this could be an empirical question. This is data that I've at least found from Cato. I mean, my understanding that for basically since the 70s, the median income, or probably even before then, but I think that the measurement was just since the 70s. The median income on each quintile is going up over time, right? Which I think would make sense when you're just looking at the overall growth of the economy, and that poverty rates going down is, you know, is what we're talking about when it comes to, like, again, people not having stuff at the poorest level. Um, when you describe how, yeah, you have some people who 20 years ago, they're poorer now because 20 years ago they were making the same, or making a certain amount of money, and then they were getting 5% raises over time, but this isn't keeping up with inflation. This is kind of my point when I'm describing inflation as this hidden tax, where it's a way to take more of somebody's income without necessarily increasing the tax of what you're directly taking. And this is, I think, one of the criticisms of having the government control the money supply, which is that they're able to do this when it comes to welfare programs or redistribution programs. And one of the effects that we did see with this massive stimulus that you're talking about is for the maybe this just reversed. If it did, I didn't hear about it. But for at least for the majority of Biden's presidency, you saw inflation outpacing wage growth. Yeah, you saw a lot of wage growth, but you saw inflation outpacing wage growth, which means that people's wages were really not overall increasing. You saw a lot of that just be eaten up by inflation. And where did that inflation come from? Well, there's a lot of global factors such as the Russian invasion and COVID supply shortages, et cetera. But even Jerome Powell again admitted like his errors when it came to the money printing. Money printing, of course, raises inflation. When you have too much money chasing too few goods, you get inflation. So, yeah, we have all this inflation to show for that stimulus. And there's also something about the stimulus that I thought was just like brutally unfair too. Maybe this offends my inner sense of justice, where you had people who were like, I knew nurses, for example, RNs that were going to work every day, and like the amount they were being paid overall was actually less than there were people than people who were unemployed who were getting the federal boost. And they got that federal boost for quite a bit. And the federal boost was pretty crazy. The initial federal boost that was proposed by the Democrats was even crazier. I don't remember the exact numbers though off the top of my head, but I remember that the Republicans actually argued the Democratic position down to the number that it was, which was also crazy. I don't understand why people need more money to survive during a pandemic than they were making beforehand, when there's already a freeze on rent, when there's already these other programs that are in place. Um, so not only did you boost a fuck ton of inflation, but you also disincentivized work, and you also arguably punished people for doing what they should be doing, which is working, and you punished people who were doing important work during a pandemic, aka being a nurse.
I mean, I guess so. I'm not. I mean, honestly, I'm not really sure who. Like nurses make pretty good money. So I mean, I just looked up. I've known several
RNs
nurses,
don't,
and
or
I don't know. I'm
LPNs.
looking up
Sorry,
here.
LPNs.
Oh, okay, sure. Maybe there are two different category, a few different categories of nurses, but In general, I mean, I think that the most that you can make, like the $600 benefit, sort of minimum, was the minimum amount that you could receive on unemployment benefits being boosted, right? And so unemployment added in that minimum benefit, but then kept the income sort of smoothing effects, which I think was, most unemployment programs will be like, oh, you'll get 70% of your, last sort of weighted average paycheck for a period of no more than 3 to 6 months or whatever. But if 70% of your last paycheck was less than this amount, then we'll just put you to the minimum benefit. And so, I mean, sure, I guess in one regard, you could say, well, it's unfair that those people don't have to work, but also I have to work. Again, the reality is that the welfare state is overwhelmingly for non workers. For the minority of people who are on the welfare state that are sort of able-bodied people participating in the labor market, I'm not sure, I'm not sure why it would be the case that we would say it's unfair, since that's a benefit that nurses qualify for if they're in the same unemployed circumstance, right? So I'm not really sure how that's unfair when everyone has the ability to take out of this program. It's just the case that people who've been laid off from their jobs are getting this money. I mean, it's not exactly preferable to be laid off, right? So I'm not sure that nurses would have a huge problem with it in general. So
When you say it's not preferable to be laid off, generally I would agree with you, because the general program is, yeah, there's, seven, depending on the state, 70, 60, whatever percent of your income, that's what you get. But for half of people during the pandemic, they were making more of unemployed people. They were making more than they were making beforehand, right? So you had people get a pay boost following this. So they weren't making less; they were making more for not working. And you had a lot of people making a whole bunch more than people, perhaps even in the same job, that didn't lose their jobs, or perhaps it would be bad for them to lose their jobs because they were LPNs and they had to go to work in order to help address the pandemic. It's true, I suppose, as with all welfare programs, that the potential applies equally, because if anybody um, falls below a certain income threshold, or if they can qualify for certain government programs, or if somebody loses their job, they can qualify for unemployment. But it's not a realized benefit, in the sense of, you had a large group of people who were benefited by losing their job and not looking for another job, because they also removed the requirements of job seeking. They were all benefited, and you were actually disincentivized to go look for a job if you were making more money off of the unemployment. And then you had a whole bunch of people who didn't have that benefit realized, and couldn't have that benefit realized, because if nobody's working, then we all die. So those people, the poor schmucks like myself who worked the pandemic, well, I mean, fucking idiots we were to actually work. We should have fucking took advantage of the system. Damn it.
well, I mean, lucky you guys not having to be laid off and having to go and wait in an unemployment line to get your benefits, right? I mean, there's two ways to think about it intuitively, and that's sort of my way. I don't really think it's I have conversations like this with my mom, right? And she has a friend who's like a very sort of like a very sort of like almost like the poster child for why we shouldn't have welfare because it's unfair, right? Someone who's very lazy, doesn't like to work, like does just the barest minimum to qualify for benefits. And my mom, she this is her best friend, so she loves this person, but she talks about this, and she says, man, it just feels bullshit that I have to go and work, and she gets to sit at home and just collect however much amount of government benefits. But the question that I always have for people that have this intuition, the question I have for my family members, the question that I've asked my mom is, well, yeah, but mom, look at your friend's lifestyle, right? She lives in a broken down trailer park. She has no stability of income or living. Yeah, she's getting maybe, I don't know, $700-800 a month that covers her barest needs. She's got 2 children she has to feed, a husband that doesn't work. Would you switch places? Like, just think about it. Would you switch places with this person? Now, overwhelmingly, the case is no. You wouldn't switch places with this person. Now, to Lactoid, to your point of the idea of, well, temporarily we had this circumstance where you could actually make pretty good money on welfare. You could actually make 30, 40 grand a year or whatever it is, just on welfare. I would agree that if your unemployment benefits specifically, so in the literature, most welfare has necessarily no effect on the labor market because, again, it's people who are non-workers anyway. But obviously, unemployment insurance is the biggest sort of welfare benefit that you might give to workers. And so, how does this affect the unemployment level? Well, of course, it's the case that if you have an incredibly generous and easily to obtain welfare state for workers, in the form of unemployment insurance, yeah, you're probably going to have some amount of negative effect on people's propensity to work. I mean, in part, that was why the benefit was temporary, right? It was only ever meant to be a temporary boost. It only ever was a temporary boost. We haven't had that benefit, I think, for like 2 years now. It's been quite a while since that program's been expired. And so now we're kind of back to our current levels. And so I can understand some grumbling during that brief period of time. But in general, it doesn't seem like anybody in the sort of taken seriously policy world, let's say, was advocating that permanently we should have an unemployment system that is worth $30,000-$40,000 a year at minimum. But at the same time, even if we did have that, you got to keep in mind, I think only like 25% of people who qualify for unemployment insurance actually end up receiving it because of administrative bureaucracy bullshit. And then we're not including the fact that in order to qualify for unemployment insurance, you have to be laid off, right? You can't have quit. And I believe if you're fired with cause, you also don't qualify for unemployment. So it's literally only the case when you're sort of economically laid off that you qualify for unemployment benefits. And again, that's a relatively small proportion of the total number of people who have, in one circumstance or another, lost their job, right? So it's ultimately never the case that this is going to be a very pervasive problem, even if we did have a generous unemployment benefit.
It's not just the case of when you're economically let go. It's state by state, and it's quite complex in terms of each case is evaluated, and so we we can't get into it. It'll just take up too much time. But
State administration of welfare benefits. Also
yeah,
cringe.
when it comes to, well, I agree with half that statement. Administration of welfare benefits cringe. I agree, but when it comes to this having an effect on the labor market, um, I don't know. I think at the time it did. You're right that I don't think anybody serious would continue that system. I thought the Democratic proposal. I think they initially came up with some fucking number. I want to say 1,200 a week or something fucking crazy, but I remember there was this big number, and perhaps it was a negotiating strategy, but still, the fact that like if they didn't have to come with that negotiating strategy, that their number would be significantly higher, and the number was already pretty high, I think was concerned me. Um, and to address the story of your mom's friend of would you trade places with them? Um, I actually like I know what you're getting at, and it's a way to sort of calm the feeling of rage that people get when they feel that somebody else is getting undeserved desserts when you're not. It's sort of like you give one monkey the grape and one monkey the banana kind of situation where that's usually what they're angry about as opposed to some kind of deeper system. But for me, and I think for a lot of libertarians generally, that's not how we look at it. We're not looking at it in terms of like, would you trade places with them? Well, no, I wouldn't trade places with them in the exact same way, maybe not to the same extent. I'll add that caveat right now, but I also wouldn't trade places with a murderer, right? Or I wouldn't trade places with somebody who's burning down houses or breaking into houses or robbing people. Where like the reason, yeah, they're probably more miserable, but that doesn't mean I can't like have a moral problem with what they're doing, or at the very least, a moral problem with the system that exists that allows them to do what they're doing and allows them to exist in the way that they're existing. Because the real reason why I have a problem with these people that do this is not because they just happen to like be living this, this lower existence. It's because they're living off my money and they're living off the money of workers, right? They're living off people who actually go to work. And I think there's a divide in leftist circles even where, communists and leftists, maybe not you, but the more tanky types are like, we are for the worker. We love the worker. And some of the initial like Marxian theory and the initial like left wing theory is really focusing on this concept of workers' rights and like the workers getting the means of production. But recently, that's kind of like the lefties I know have kind of dropped that and are moving much more to just like, well, I'm not really concerned about the worker getting what they're earned, like what they're supposed to get. I'm just more concerned with there being a more equitable economy with people just having like incomes that are more or less kind of close to each other, even if they work or don't work, which I think that's even more toxic than the old
Well, I
leftists.
mean,
I
again,
would
we have to
prefer.
you have to contend with the issue, though, again, that we're talking about a great minority of people who are on welfare benefits, are able-bodied workers, right? Most of the spending that every country, not the U.S., every country, most welfare spending is the overwhelming portion is going to go to non-workers, right? So I be, on one hand, if we want to have this weird view that it's able-bodied workers shouldn't qualify for welfare because they could just work, okay, I mean, fine, that's sort of a compartmentalized argument, but children, right, the elderly, people with disabilities, these are people who cannot and probably should not work. We can expand it into two other groups: students, caregivers. We want people to be in training and in education. Again, I said earlier, when you give poor, very, very poor people money, childhood educational attainment goes up because children don't have to work as much, right? And these are things that I would consider like strict moral goods, right? That it's bad when children grow up in poverty because they just simply had the bad luck of growing up in a poor family. Elderly people, it's bad that they grow up in poverty, or they grow up in poverty. It's bad that they age into poverty and they die in poverty, because fundamentally these are non-workers who cannot support themselves, right? And so those groups of people are the biggest takers from the welfare state, and I think they also have intuitively the strongest moral claim to some amount of sort of public assistance. A child growing up in poverty, just there's nothing the child did to be born in that circumstance, right? I mean, it seems like those are the most moral dollars we can spend, is money going towards children who grew up in poverty, right? I mean, this is, and it's also not just from an intrinsic perspective, but the outcomes associated with those dollars seem to be so much more apparently positive as well.
I don't think that you have a right to the property and labor of other people just because you happen to be born in a specific circumstance, or what you're born as, or anything like that. But I will agree with you that at least most people in America, and well, most people probably have a much stronger intuition when it comes to giving free shit or stolen shit to kids, as opposed to other groups of people, right? Like people who can work. I mean, everybody thinks they should work, even people who are like moderately left. Now you get to like the anti-work movement, and you got people who are just absolutely off the wall when it comes to their conception of labor. So, leaving them aside, most people can agree that able-bodied people should work. But I'm curious, and maybe we can use this as a springboard to talk a little bit about Social Security and the sovereign wealth fund of Norway that you like so much, which
God,
is
how
old.
base Norway is.
Um, inferior to Sweden. Okay, I got some stories about that. But when it comes to old people, I mean, this is going to sound insensitive, but I mean every word of it. You have people here who like had their entire lives to earn and save money. They absolutely had a chance. And first of all, why should Social Security exist? First, generally speaking, and if you can make a good argument for why it should even exist for old people, um, surely you think that it can be done better than it currently is, because it is complete trash right now.
Let's put a pin in that, because this is going to be probably the rest of the discussion will be this. So
Okay,
before we get to that, I do want to read the rest of the super chats and
fair.
things like that.
Do it.
$20 from Lawson Harrison to say this. Seems to me,
$20.
yes, $20.
Big spender.
Exactly.
I know Lawson. He's a good guy. He works hard. He works
He
for that
is,
money.
and he chooses to spend that money on WhickTV. He is an example to us all. Again, this is one of the reasons I prefer UBI to food stamps. You can't buy a sub to WhickTV with food stamps. Not yet. We're working on it, gang. We're working on it, gang. Okay, anyway, $20. Seems to me that the question is, how much does the public's perception of the economy affect the actual functionality of the economy? And
Yeah.
one more question, and then you guys can discuss this if you'd like. Skill Tree Gaming for $5 says, what do you guys think of Ecuador's new libertarian president balancing the budget in the first month for the first time in 12 years? Also, is MMT...
Did they say Ecuador?
Ecuador. They said Ecuador in their thing. I'm
Oh.
reading the chat.
Maybe
I think they
Ecuador
mean
has a
Venezuela.
libertarian president as well as Argentina.
I mean, it's all the same, right? I mean, it's all one country. It's all. I thought it was all
Look,
Ecuador.
There you go.
they're all
Hispanic,
I just used the wrong,
besides
I
Brazilians.
just used the wrong country too, right? So fair.
There you go.
Right.
I would say that to the chatter's question, I guess there's probably some psychological effect of like productivity and stuff. If people perceive the economy to be like so incredibly fucked, there's probably some deleterious effects on sort of aggregate output. But I don't know. It seems like most people are able to pretty cleanly disaggregate their opinions on the economy and also their opinions on their personal financial situation. When you look at when you look at polls that say, how do you feel about the economy, but then how do you feel about your own financial situation? It seems like a lot of the people who say the economy is shit will also say my actual personal situation is pretty good. So I'm not really sure if there's a very big effect of people who think, oh, the economy is shit, and that actually causes economic problems. It just seems like a lot of people have sort of almost like you could say like very sensationalized views on the economy, but they don't necessarily have those same sensationalized views about their personal situation.
And $5 before you respond, $5 follow up from Lawson Harrison to say, thank God I was able to shingle houses in July and avoid that horrible and dangerous welfare line. Thank you for the $5. Okay, Lactoid, if you want to address those questions, feel free.
Okay, can you repeat the first question for me again? I apologize.
Sure. It seems to me that the question is how much does the public's perception of the economy affect the actual functionality of the economy?
There's probably some effect, right? Where people have a perception or something, they're going to act on that. And an economy is just like a collective group of actors that are all doing things. So, if you feel the economy's bad, and so because of that, you're not spending, or you're spending on certain things. Maybe you're stockpiling, I don't know, ammo and food tins in your basement because you think the world's going
Contributing
to
to
end.
the grocery and gun economy, you mean?
Sure, you're contributing to the gun and grocery economy, but like that's a very specific industry that is now being bolstered at the expense of perhaps other industries because people hold this belief. And there's a lot of people where I think that there's examples of this that are very stark, like cryptocurrency, where people's belief on what it's valued is arguably the entire value of what it is. So yeah, perceptions absolutely matter. In this particular case, I'm guessing what the asker is referring to is like, well, people perceive the economy as doing bad generally, but like according to XYZ metrics, we don't think it's all doing that bad. I mean, if people's perception is just wrong, then they're fucking wrong. But yeah, it's going to affect their behavior. To what extent, I don't know. Yeah.
That's fair. And now, when we talk about the second question, Argentina and their president, what are our thoughts there? Be brief, and then we'll
Can I
get to
Let me clarify one thing.
Sure.
All value is based on what people perceive it as, generally speaking, as a concept of value. But cryptocurrency, I think, is very much about short-term perception as regards to long-term perception, which is what the differentiation I would make between the two. All right, sorry. Go ahead and answer.
Yeah, I guess, personally, I would say, if we're talking about Javier Milei, I know that Ecuador recently, well, not recently, but I think about a year or two
Argentina?
ago, they did elect a center-right government. Yeah, go
Right.
on, Wick, sorry.
Oh no, you said Ecuador? Are you talking about Argentina?
Probably got
No, that's what
you.
I'm saying. If we are talking
He
about
did. He
Ecuador,
clarified to
literally.
me. He chatted that he meant Argentina.
Oh, he did mean
Yes,
Argentina.
he
Okay,
means
perfect. So if we
Argentina.
are actually talking about Argentina, then yeah, I mean Javier Milei. I mean, I think that the reality is, I think there's probably a better way to go about fixing the Argentine economy than basically selling off state assets and privatizing a whole bunch of stuff. Now, the reality is, like, are some of the problems with Argentina, bureaucratization and overregulation? I mean, of course, that's probably the case, right? I mean, it's almost certainly the case that any sort of, like, if we could peer into the universe and look at the optimal path for Argentinian economic success, it's probably going to involve some level of cutting regulations and some level of debureaucratizing the state. But I would just say that, some of the things that he's done would probably not be optimal, like this sort of shock therapy of trying to sell off state assets, things like that. I think that one thing that he did that arguably is bad, the effects we'll see, like he's changed it to where I think landlords can require their tenants pay in other currencies. Arguably, this isn't the biggest deal because the Argentinian economy is so informalized at this point with the US dollar anyway. Like maybe most people just don't really feel the effect because most people don't use pesos anyway on a day-to-day basis, but that's probably bad. And in general, his economic philosophy, obviously, he's an anarcho-capitalist. It's honestly one of the most insane things that an anarcho-capitalist became the president of a huge country. It's really shocking that that's the case, but that is the case. And obviously, I would say anarcho-capitalism is quite bad. And I would also say some of his foreign policy stuff has been pretty terrible as well. Like I don't. It seems like suspending relations with Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua. Like I get it, they're autocratic countries, but you should probably still maintain diplomatic lines even with countries that are autocratic. It seems kind of weird to do the opposite. It doesn't seem like it's in the interest of your own people. And he's being really antagonistic with Brazil as well because Lula's a filthy, corrupt socialist. And it's like, dude, again, like it just seems like it's probably best to maintain good diplomatic sort of relations with these huge regional trading partners. But hey, that's just me, I guess. I don't know. What do you think about Javier Milei-Lactoid?
I love Javier Milei, 𝖲𝖏. He is
Why don't you
fucking
move to
awesome.
Argentina then,
I'm
Lactoid?
it's getting to that point where I'm considering it. He's so fucking great. I think that not so he's great in every regard, except for maybe like one or two. You can maybe point me to something he did stupid. I don't know, but generally he's fucking awesome. And he's good for America if he actually does adopt the U.S. dollar, increases the power of the U.S. currency, and it's good for Argentina because that has an inflation mediating effect, especially in a country like Argentina, which before Milei took over had an inflation rate in the six figures. It was, it was like 104%. I don't mean like 104,000%, but it was like 104%. So three figures. So yeah, real shitty inflation, bloated government, super leftist government functions. I'm pretty sure like 1% of government agencies were specifically reserved for transgender people, and those spots could not be given to anybody else. So just like flat out like quotaing certain positions. They were spending a lot, like they had entire like equity, DEI councils and government programs, and Javier Milei came in and said, no, we're going to change everything. And we got the first surplus in a long time. And I'm really excited to see where Argentina goes. I think Argentina is going to be better off for it, obviously. I think the world's going to be better off for it. I agree with being strong on authoritarian communist countries. I think one of the biggest criticisms I have of my other home country, Sweden, is that they continue to trade with the Nazis during World War II. Ideally, they wouldn't have, and there's a lot of complex politics there. But I think that's what you do when you empower countries like China and Cuba and Venezuela. You shouldn't be empowering those countries, and you should be implementing free market policies at home, which is what Javier Milei has done. I think what we're going to see is kind of similar to what we saw in Chile, which is, you have this stagnant leftist economy, and then you have a right winger who's more free market oriented take over and set up the country to be one of the strongest economies in South America for the next coming decades. If I'm wrong on that, then you'll all laugh at me and it'll be good for you. But I don't think I'm going to be wrong on that. I think you're going to see a resurgence in Argentina, and if it gets good enough, maybe I'll move there.
There we
Okay.
go.
But I do want to, well, thank you for the money, gang. But I do want to get to Lactoid's question on Social Security. Can you restate, just so 𝖲𝖏 is familiar, and then for the last 20 minutes or so, we'll talk about that, and then we'll get to closings. Sound good, gang? Sound good.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So my question was, I know that you're a big fan of sovereign wealth funds, and um, to some extent, maybe I'm not going to hide the ball so much. I think that they are in some ways superior to the current Social Security system. So maybe you'd just be in favor of abolishing Social Security and replacing it with that. But at the very least, can we agree that Social Security, as done in America, is fucking terrible? It's a Ponzi scheme. I think there was an analysis by the St. Louis Fed or something where it's like for the 98% of people, if they just invested that money in the stock market, like they would make more money off of the money that's being taken to their paychecks than if they give it to Social Security. And the whole reason why Social Security is being propped up is because it's a fucking Ponzi scheme. And the old people who are politically powerful are already bought into the Ponzi scheme, so they don't want to let it die. Is that like what do you think about my analysis?
I mean, I would agree that there's probably more optimal ways to structure Social Security. I mean, fundamentally, though, there's like every retirement system on the planet that is good at alleviating poverty is some sort of forced savings, right? It's some kind of forced savings, right? You're taking money either from some people and giving it to other people, and you have this entitlement program where the money you paid in, not that you're getting those exact same dollars out, but you can expect to have, sort of equitable benefits by the time that you're older. Um, or it's some sort of, mandatory contribution system where you get that money out or you're allowed to access that money when you retire. And so there's really no getting out of the fact that if you want elderly people to not overwhelmingly be in poverty, I mean, again, pre Social Security, we had like 50, 60% poverty rates for elderly people, right? Number one, in a large part, that's because very, very poor people just simply don't have the money, right? They don't have the money to put away for retirement, and they don't have that money their entire lives, right? And so that's probably the most important thing to keep in mind. Number two, um, it's just the case plainly that when we implemented even Social Security, which is a transfer payment. We're transferring money from workers to elderly non-workers in this case, or let's say elderly non-working former workers, because Social Security is not a truly universal benefit. Um, and so in that regard, yes, it's a transfer program, but I don't think that, I don't think transfer income is stealing, or, this sort of libertarian philosophical jargon of theft and stealing and slavery and, inceldom and stuff. I wouldn't quite describe it in those terms. But what it is very effective at alleviating poverty. So I think that even the way that we structure Social Security in America is very good at accomplishing the goal of alleviating poverty. And the U.S. doesn't even, the U.S.'s fiscal state in terms of Social Security and retirement benefits isn't nearly as dire as some other countries, right? Greece had like full blown economic meltdowns because of their incredibly generous pension scheme, where you could retire at 60 with a very generous income. If you do stuff like that, yeah, you're probably going to have drains on the economy because, again, if you're taxing current workers and giving it to older people who are not working, well, you're taking money from productive entities and giving them to unproductive entities disproportionately, right? So I think it's very important to keep that in mind, that there is a limit to like the amount of welfare you can give. What I will say though, however, is that if you tax things very, very efficiently, and this is something that we proved in the last Three Wonks episode, actually, the one about UBI, was that shockingly, you could actually fund $3,400 a month for every single adult with very little deadweight loss associated with taxation. Now, to be fair, a benefit that high would probably cause problems with working, so maybe even if you could, you probably shouldn't. But the point is to say that the ability to tax and spend on welfare, the capacity to do that in a way that's efficient, is actually quite a bit larger than what we currently do in terms of welfare spending.
So I'm against forced savings, almost by like tautologically forced savings. Obviously, that's something I'd be opposed to. I do think it's stealing. Well, it could be stealing depending on how it's done, right? If you're taking money from one person and giving it to another, that's obviously stealing. If it's forced savings, when you're like mandate somebody save like 10% of their income or whatever, I think Singapore does this, where it's not like they don't really have like a social security program in the same way, but it's like by government mandate, you have to put a certain amount of money into like a savings account or like some kind of 401k system, where then like you can access it when you get older. I think that you like the forced savings issue dodges some of the issues with Social Security. A big issue with Social Security is again you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. But another reason is that it creates, like all Ponzi schemes, it creates an issue when the inflow begins to drop compared to the outflow. So most Ponzi schemes collapse when they run out of people to scam, right? Because then you have this pyramid that's built on bringing new people into the system, and when you can't bring new people into the system, the whole tower of dominoes falls. And so, if you're experiencing, let's say, something like the Western world is experiencing, like a fertility drop, and or maybe even in Japan, like some places in the East, well, even China. So I guess everywhere in the world except for certain developing countries, you're seeing, I think, a real issue that's going to happen when it comes to pensions and retirement. We're going to have a increasingly small group of young people being forced to pay for this life of elderly people who disproportionately have more wealth than the young people they're taking money from. Right?
Wouldn't
Old
that
people
just
in America at least make more money than younger people do. They have more assets than younger people do at the very least. So I don't even think that poor people. I don't know why old people being poor is like a bigger problem than young people being poor. I mean, I don't even think being poor is necessarily like a government problem to begin with. But I especially don't see why it's more important to alleviate elderly poor people as opposed to young people, poor people. And then when it comes to pension schemes, yeah, I mean Greece, Illinois is another example of an area, locality that has a terrible fucking um, uh, retirement situation going on where their unfunded obligations have like exceeded the GDP. I think the math worked out like every person in Illinois would have to pay 80 grand in order to equalize and actually pay the unfunded pension obligations. Absolutely disturbing. I think this is just like a natural byproduct of having the government do this shit
I
for
mean, I'm
political
perfectly
reasons.
willing to criticize bad, sort of poorly funded retirement systems, right? But I just don't think that it seems like a lot of countries are able, perfectly well to afford their current level of pension benefits. Now, to some degree, you might have to reform your systems as you find that certain cost pressures exist or whatnot. I would say that even in terms of depopulation, right? At least America specifically, let's say,
Why we have
is able
immigration.
to.
But anyway.
Well, I'm just, yeah, exactly. Like, at least in America specifically, we're able to avoid this problem for a pretty extended a period of time because we will have an increasing population for much longer as projected than many European countries. I mean, even people don't realize that Russia's had a decreasing population for a pretty good while now. Just like Japan, it seems like Japan's the only country that gets talked about in terms of a decreasing population, but Russia's had a decreasing population for a while. China's beginning to have a
China
decreasing
now.
population. Yeah, so I mean, it's really happening all across the world. But again, even in a world with a decreasing population, you can structure a social security system in a way that is not necessarily pay-go, which is kind of what we're describing now. You pay for current beneficiaries concurrently, but you could structure a system a little bit more like you could take an Australian model style system where they have almost this government sponsored 401k. You put money into it, and I think the government matches some amount of it as well. And then you have this means tested social security benefit at the end of the day. That way, you save a lot of money because a lot of the money that you put into the retirement system yourself is private dollars. So, that's privatized sort of forced savings accounts. And then you have a means tested benefit on the back end, which is, in terms of cost to the government, much cheaper than this slightly more universal benefit that we give to elderly people today. And there's a number of reasons why means testing an elderly benefit might be more efficient than not means testing it. I would also say that, again, if we had a UBI, right, you could save a lot of money on Social Security if you had something like a universal cash assistance program, because you'd be able to save a lot of money on administrating other welfare benefits. But also, if you're giving everyone like $500 a month, in theory, you could decrease Social Security payments by, let's say, $250 a month. So elderly people are better off, but the actual spending that you're spending on the retirement system goes down substantially. I mean, I think there's like, I think I looked at the numbers. There's like a really crazy amount of people who are on Social Security, like 50, 60 million or something like that, like a really large percentage of the population. And um, the average benefit is, $1,600. So if you were to take that average benefit down by 250 million, well, obviously that's the average monthly benefit, right? So, if you're able to decrease the average monthly benefit by $250 and, you multiply that by 12, so that's $3,000 a year. And you multiply that by literally 50 million. I mean, what does that come to? That's like $150 billion a year that you're saving on Social Security right off the bat. And that's not to mention that there are some simple changes you can do with Social Security that greatly extend the life of the program, like taxing every dollar the same. So, for instance, right now, incomes above about $150,000 don't pay into Social Security. So, if all you did was tax every labor dollar the same, then you'd be able to fill 3/4 of the gap in funding for like the next 25, 30 years in Social Security. And I don't think that's an unreasonable policy. Again, we're talking about a program as well for people listening. The most effective poverty reduction program in the history of our country is Social Security, right? So it's quite a decent investment if you feel like elderly people living in poverty is quite bad. Last thing I'll say, Lactoid mentions, well, why should we care about old people more than we care about young people? So I would say that we should care about all of them. It's just that it seems like poverty rates, a welfareless society, it seems like in that society, elderly people are significantly disproportionately impacted by that. Able-bodied people without welfare can work. children without welfare are not as costly to support as elderly people. So a lot of them do get the support that they need even without welfare. A lot of them don't, to be fair. But elderly people fall into the worst of both buckets, which is that they're expensive to support and they can't work. And so that's why the poverty rates that I mentioned before, this sort of like early welfare society, pre-welfare society, the poverty rates for elderly people were 50, 60%. Like we've yet to have poverty like that for any of these other groups that I'm talking about, students, able-bodied poor people, children, people with disabilities. And again, part of that is just because of this confluence of factors with elderly people. So Social Security based, and we should definitely keep funding it until the wheels fall off, if you ask me. All right.
I don't deny that. Yeah, if you give a bunch of money to a group of people, like old people who again already have more assets than the rest of us, that they're going to be wealthier and happier with that.
You
But
could means test it though. I mean, that would solve
you
that
you you
problem, right?
you could, yeah. If you means tested it, that would solve that specific problem, no doubt. A question. This is like a kind of a thought experiment. Let's assume that what I said was correct when I said that like for 97% of people, if they had the money that they otherwise paid into Social Security, if they had simply taken that money and put it in the stock market or even government bonds, for example, like the vast majority of them would make more money overall for their retirement. Let's just assume that's true for a second. If that is true, and leaving aside any kind of alternative pension programs for a second, between having Social Security and not having Social Security, those are the only two options. Why wouldn't you just not have Social Security and allow people to make the decision to either be better off when they're older, or maybe they want to spend their money when they're young and live it up? Give them that autonomy, that choice of what to do with their own labor, as opposed to mandate that they have to inefficiently set a certain amount aside so the poverty rate gets lower when they're old.
Yeah, so I would argue that Social Security per dollar is not necessarily an inefficient use of funds. I think that what you find in a lot of the literature on Social Security spending is that there are certain sort of economic burdens that old people place on other people because of the fact that they don't have this robust Social Security benefit. So, for instance, for the elderly people that aren't living just in abject poverty with very, very little assistance, a lot of those other elderly people have to live with their children, right? And having a society where elderly people have to live with their children is probably not an economic boost. It's probably more of a drain than anything. One interesting study I found was that a 33% decline in the proportion of elderly people living in a shared living arrangement is the phrase that they used to be a little bit nicer, I guess. Which is probably a good thing for the economy. Obviously, you pay that in the form of a payroll tax, so that's probably good. To answer your question in terms of why not just let people make the choice to invest in the market? Obviously, part of the reason is that most like poor people don't necessarily have an ability to do that, and those are the people sort of disproportionately affected by the time that they retire by not having money. Again, it's poor people don't have the money at any sort of point in time in their life to invest in the stock market. I mean, even today, with relatively high incomes, I think only it's like a slight majority of people have any sort of stock ownership, much less poor people. Poor people have very, very little stock ownership. And so that's why, force everyone to pay a little bit into the system. But then net transfers to poor people are higher than they pay in taxes. So you're not totally fucking poor people over by having them pay a little bit of payroll tax. And then by the time that they retire, they have this benefit that they can rely on. Also, I would say that having a sovereign wealth fund is probably better than having sort of individual retirement accounts, mostly because, like I said, number one, poor people aren't able to really invest money into the market. Number two, even if they were able to, it's not clear that that's actually an efficient investment. Most people are bad at investing money, whereas allowing the government to actively manage a sovereign wealth fund in a way that basically is structured like any university endowment where we expect 4 to 6% return on a given year, that's a much more efficient use of money and allocation of capital than basically just having everyone manage their own little individual retirement account. And it also significantly smooths consumption and smooths income, right? We don't necessarily want people to invest retirement money in volatile assets because by the time that they retire, well, what do you have left, right? And what if you retire at a point when the economy's gone down by 20, 30%, well, that's bad, right? Because now maybe you can't retire anymore, even if you were planning on it, even if you're not able to work anymore. And so, government administration of this kind of thing is probably more efficient for a number of reasons.
I think that what you said when you said, poor people don't have the money to invest. It- Obviously, what I'm talking about is just the money that's taken from their paycheck. Like it was like if 97% of people over the term of the study, if 97% of people had simply taken the money that's taken out of their paychecks by Social Security every 2 weeks and put that in the stock market and like some standard non-volatile ETFs, like it tracks the S&P 500, 97% of them would have made more money for their retirement. And then I think the study also showed that if they put it in bonds, it was still more than half would have made more money than for Social Security. So I think one of the reasons why these poor people, the poor working people, don't have all this money to invest is because a big chunk of it's being deducted from their paycheck by
Yeah.
the Social Security Administration. And you could say, well, even if it wasn't deducted, they're poor people. They're probably going to waste the money anyway. Put crudely, I don't disagree that most people, probably a lot of Americans, like even rich people, they don't, they live paycheck to paycheck in America. Like I saw some like crazy stat of like a significant percentage of people who make over $200,000 a year. It was like a third or a fourth, like or something like that, live paycheck to
I'm
paycheck
gonna
because
be
they're
real.
just
I don't
fucking.
believe that stat, but fair enough.
I'll send it to you. Americans are just shit with money. So are people, especially on like the lower end of income, obviously. And so are these people going to like save the money? I guess I can't guarantee they will. You could argue, well, we're going to make them save, so we're going to force them to put it into a forced savings account, like Singapore does, or that would be superior to Social Security. But for me, my position is, look, uh, they're an adult. You should be able to let adults do what they do. If you decide to have a higher standard of living when you're younger, and you pay for that by having a lower standard of living later in life when life sucks anyway because you're old and it sucks being old, then that's your decision. And I'm not gonna. I don't. I think it's paternalistic at the very least to make that decision for somebody else.
Okay, gang. We are coming up on the end here, and I want to give each of these individuals a chance to uh, close, have closing thoughts on everything we've talked about, as well as tell people and remind people where you can find them if you want to find them. Gang, it's been a great discussion. It's a little different than what we've been doing the rest of the week, right? We had the horse drama yesterday, right? And we had a man sets himself on fire drama Monday. But tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern, we're going to do more politics stuff. We're going to have Fabian Liberty Scott, Lauren De Laguna, and also Admiral Gibbs are coming on to face off with counterpoints and Rashad Crenshaw and maybe a special surprise guest about is the GOP being infiltrated by Russian influence. So that'll be fun. Another politics panel. I hope you
What a
tune
group
into
of
that.
people to discuss that question, Wick.
It's gonna be great. It's gonna be fun.
I'm gonna have to tune in myself.
You should. But for now, I want to give each of these lovely, lovely young, totally not incel men a chance to have their closing thoughts. And we're going to start with Econoboy, and then we'll let Lactoid have their last word. Go ahead, Econoboy. Closing thoughts.
Yeah, sure. I think that Lactoid's right to point out that there's going to be some very foundational moral intuitions that distinguish between the two of us. Obviously, most people don't really deeply consider their moral philosophy. Most people might just say, "Oh, I'm a Christian." I look at the Bible, and by that they mean I look at some portions of the Bible most of the time, right? And that's about as deep as most people get in terms of their morality outside of their basic intuitions. That's why, in part, I do appeal to people's basic intuitions because it just seems like it's the case that most people would agree with my more sort of deeply thought out conviction that poverty is bad. And insofar as welfare programs and collectivized institutions can decrease poverty and decrease inequality and increase, sort of transitively social cohesion and things like this, that those are good things. That if we can do things that maintain innovation, growth, sort of economic competitiveness, and at the same time we can have a world with substantially less people living in poverty. then I would say that that's a preferable world, even if that world includes some level of, collective ownership or government taxation. It's good when a poor kid anywhere in the country has access to a public school, right? In the U.S., obviously, we have some of the worst examples of public schools, but obviously in many other countries, they've figured out how to run public schools quite well, and in most, even circumstances today, public schools are decently quality. It's good when people can call the police, whether you're in a poor neighborhood or a rich neighborhood, and a publicly funded police officer shows up and writes down your problem and goes from there. These are good things. Fire departments are the same thing. The military is the same thing. But I would argue to go a little bit further. State investment bank is probably a good idea. Sovereign wealth fund is probably a good idea. Taxing things like resource rents and whatnot to fund these things would be good. And a great expansion of the welfare state. I think that there's many very sympathetic groups of people in our society who are born into circumstances that make their lives inherently harder, despite the fact that they didn't choose to be born in those circumstances, I should say. Poor children, poor people with disabilities, things like this. Many other more sort of groups of people that people are sympathetic to. Wounded veterans and things like this who. I would say that we have some sort of moral responsibility towards, and insofar as that's an appealing argument, and in a democratic society, we vote to do these policies, understanding what our institutions do and understanding the outcomes, and sort of necessity to vote if you greatly disagree with what's being proposed. I feel like, especially in that circumstance, it's very righteous to do things that would reduce poverty and alleviate sort of financial destitution. So that's what I advocate for. That's why I believe in a big welfare state and some level of collective ownership and government services and things like that. Oh, and I guess subscribe to Econoboy on YouTube or at @the3wonks, youtube.com/@the3wonks for more policy discussions. So there you go.
Check them out, gang. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being willing to come out and have your say. I really enjoyed the conversation. I know it was policy based, right? So a lot of people were like, but I wasn't. I was engaged. Lactoid, last word, and tell people where they can find you.
Yeah. So I guess in summary, I think the things that Econoboy presents, although he's not, I wouldn't say he's a full-on communist, right? I think that his podcast is sort of split up into. I think the most reasonable person there is named Micah, I believe, right? He's pretty dope, and then you have SDL, who I go way back with, who's got crazy economic positions, and then you kind of play the middleman, so that's kind of the moderate. I think there's some things you said that I agree with. There's a lot that I don't agree with. I think fundamentally the things that we don't agree with, that we don't agree with each other on, really do come down to a level of philosophical differences that exist. I mean, this was actually I really enjoyed this debate. It was one where uh, it was there wasn't a lot of bickering over very specific empirical claims. There was just like a more flowing kind of conversation about what kind of world we want to see. Um, I think that fundamentally, I would characterize your vision that you just described and the leftist vision generally as being fundamentally rooted in a kind of paternalism of sort of, we want you to continue to have, stuff. We want you to not be impoverished. And so we want to set up this system in a way that we will care for you. We, the government, will care for you. But my answer is just look, if you get more money throughout your entire life working and you decide to blow it all in fancy sports cars and alcohol and all that fun stuff, and you happen to be poor now that you're old, tough titties. Part of being an adult is facing consequences for your actions. I know people don't want to hear that, but fundamentally, I don't think that just because people have put themselves in a bad position, that they can therefore take the things that other people create in order to alleviate their position. I think that's my fundamental perspective, and I think that's Javier Milei's fundamental perspective, and that's why he's going to fix Argentina. If you like what I had to say, you could find me at 𝕾𝖍𝖎𝖙 on Twitch, Twitter, and YouTube. Thank you, both of you, for one of the best debates I've had in a very long time.
Oh, this is just the standard on WhickTV. No, thank you both for being here. Gang, we're going to raid out to him on Twitch. Econoboy, are you streaming on YouTube right now?
On Twitch and YouTube, Wick.
On Twitch, on YouTube. We'll do you on YouTube, and we'll do Blacktoid on Twitch. So both of you get a raid. Okay, let me set that up
Alrighty.
real quick. That I can split. the
Very
difference.
equitable. Very equitable.
Exactly.
Like,
That's true. If it was based on performance, I would get both raids.
Look, I
but then you would still argue for equity, right? You still want to give
True,
me
of
some of your
course.
viewers
Of
because
course,
you're.
I would
yeah.
distribute some of my viewers to you naturally.
Okay. So, gang, remember tomorrow, 6 p.m. Eastern. Got some great guests lined up to talk about well, the GOP being infiltrated by Russians. So yeah, check us out tomorrow and let's raid out. Wave bye everyone. I know you can't wave, Econoboy, not really, but
Bye guys, it was fun.
Okay.
See ya.
See you. Bye. Oh god, this rating I know there's a setting to take the raid timer down. Anyway, we'll see you guys